The ink on their marriage certificate wasn't even dry when he pushed the divorce papers across the mahogany desk. Cedric didn't look at her. He was too busy inspecting the fraying edge of his velvet cuff. Most brides would weep, scream, or beg. Beatrice just noticed the draft rattling the window pane, the smell of damp wool, and the suffocating silence of the bridal suite. She didn't shatter. She reached for the pen. It was the best decision she ever made. Here is how a discarded bride ended up wearing the crown. The dress weighed 40 pounds. Beatrice had spent the last 7 hours carrying it, dragging the miles of Duchess satin and thousands of hand-stitched seed pearls across marble floors, chapel steps, and reception carpets. Now, standing in the center of the master bedroom of the Montgomery estate, the gown felt less like a triumph and more like a beautifully constructed cage. Her ribs ached. The whalebone corset had been pulled tight enough to satisfy her mother's vanity, digging a sharp, constant pressure into her left hip bone. The room smelled of beeswax, cold fireplace ash, and the faint, cloying scent of wilted lilies brought up from the chapel. It was perfectly quiet. Downstairs, the last of the aristocratic guests were likely drowning themselves in her father's expensive champagne, celebrating a union that saved the Harrington family from bankruptcy and gave the Montgomerys the political backing they craved. The heavy oak door clicked open. Cedric stepped in. He didn't carry the nervous energy of a groom, nor the predatory swagger of a man expecting a wedding night. He looked entirely, devastatingly bored. He smelled of gin and damp cigar smoke. His cravat was already undone, hanging loosely around his neck, and his dark hair was ruffled not by passion, but by the nervous habit of running his fingers through it when he was irritated. He didn't look at her. Instead, he walked straight to the writing desk by the window, a heavy mahogany piece that looked entirely too large for the room. He reached inside his tailcoat, pulled out a thick folded parchment, and dropped it onto the wood. The slap of the paper was terrifyingly loud in the quiet room. "Sign it," Cedric said. His voice was a flat, gravelly baritone. He still wasn't looking at her. He was staring out the window at the rain lashing against the glass. Beatrice stood frozen. The seed pearls clicked against each other as she shifted her weight. "Sign what?" "A petition for dissolution." Cedric finally turned. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, rimmed with exhaustion. There was no malice in them, only cold, hard pragmatism. "My lawyers drew it up 3 days ago. Grounds of irreconcilable differences, or whatever lie makes it palatable for the magistrates. The dowry your father paid remains untouched. It goes back to him. Your debts are cleared. You keep the title of a divorcee, which is scandalous, I know, but you're rich again. You'll survive." Beatrice stared at the parchment. Her mind felt sluggish, stuffed with cotton. She had known Cedric didn't love her. Their courtship consisted of 4 supervised teas and a stiff waltz where he stared over her shoulder the entire time. But this? Tonight? "You couldn't wait until morning?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake. She noted that with a distant sort of pride. "If we consummate the marriage, the legalities become sticky," Cedric replied, tapping his signet ring against the desk. Click, click, click. The sound grated against her frayed nerves. "I have no intention of touching you, Beatrice, and I have no intention of spending the next 40 years pretending I don't despise this arrangement. I am in love with someone else, a woman my family deems inappropriate. I married you to secure my inheritance. Now that the papers are signed, the trust is mine. I don't need you." The brutality of his honesty was almost refreshing. Beatrice walked slowly toward the desk. Her feet burned in her silk slippers. She looked down at the paper. The legal jargon was dense, but at the bottom, Cedric's signature was already scrawled in thick black ink. She waited for the devastation to hit. She waited for the tears, the righteous anger, the urge to throw the heavy brass inkwell at his perfectly sculptured head. But all she felt was a sudden, dizzying wave of relief. She didn't have to stay in this cold house. She didn't have to share a bed with a man who looked at her like a piece of misplaced furniture. She didn't have to play the dutiful Montgomery wife. "Do you have a pen?" she asked. Cedric blinked. It was the first time his composed facade slipped. His brow furrowed, a tiny crease appearing between his eyes. "You aren't going to fight this? Your father—" "My father got his debts paid," Beatrice interrupted, her tone flat. "And you got your inheritance. The transaction is complete." She reached for the quill resting on the silver tray, dipped it deliberately into the inkwell, and leaned over the desk. The corset pinched viciously at her ribs. She ignored it. She signed her name with a flourish she didn't know she possessed. Beatrice Harrington, not Montgomery. She dropped the quill. It left a tiny splatter of black on the polished mahogany. "There," she said, stepping back. "I'll have my maid pack my trunks. I assume you'll arrange a carriage to take me back to town before dawn. I'd rather not be here when the servants come up with breakfast." Cedric stared at her, an unsettling mixture of confusion and relief on his face. "Beatrice, He stopped. There was nothing left to say. He nodded once, stiffly, and walked out of the room. When the door clicked shut, Beatrice was alone again. She reached around to the small of her back, her fingers fumbling with the tiny, unforgiving hooks of her gown. She couldn't reach them. With a sudden, frustrated yank, she pulled the fabric forward. The sound of tearing silk echoed in the empty room. It was the best sound she had heard all day. 3 weeks later, the scandal had settled over the London aristocracy like a thick, choking fog. The discarded bride. That was what the broadsheets called her. Beatrice had spent the first fortnight sequestered in her family's townhouse. The air inside had smelled constantly of her mother's burning lavender incense, an attempt to mask the stench of social ruin. Her father had yelled until his voice gave out, pacing the threadbare Persian rugs, furious that his daughter had returned, even if her dowry had miraculously remained intact. But Beatrice refused to wither. Hiding made her look guilty. Hiding made it seem like her heart was broken. So she attended the Royal Summer Gala. The ballroom of the St. James Palace was a sensory assault. The heat was oppressive, generated by the bodies of 400 nobles packed into a space designed for 2. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck, heavy musk perfumes, and the sharp tang of sweat trying to be concealed under powder. Beatrice stood in a shadowy alcove near the terrace doors, a glass of lukewarm, surprisingly cheap champagne in her hand. She wore a dress of deep, bruised plum. No pastels. No virginal white. She let the whispers wash over her. They hit her back like tiny, blunt stones. Look at her. Didn't even last the night. I hear she was deformed. I hear he caught her with a stable boy. She took a sip of the champagne. It tasted like vinegar and copper. She swallowed it anyway. It's awful, isn't it? The voice came from her right, deep, slightly raspy, as if the speaker was recovering from a long illness or a night of heavy shouting. Beatrice turned. A man was leaning against the marble pillar of the alcove. He was tall, dressed in severe black evening wear that lacked the ostentatious medals most men of his rank paraded around. His collar was slightly crooked. He had dark hair, a sharp jawline dusted with evening stubble, and eyes the color of dirty slate. But what drew her attention was his right hand wrapped loosely around a whiskey tumbler. The skin across his knuckles and wrist was thick, pink, and warped, a severe burn scar that disappeared up his sleeve. She recognized him instantly. Everyone knew the scar. Adrian, the Crown Prince. "Your Highness," Beatrice said, offering a shallow, perfunctory curtsy. Her knees popped slightly. "The champagne? Yes, it's criminal." Adrian snorted. It wasn't a polite aristocratic sound. It was an ugly, real noise. "I meant the staring. They look at you like you're a zoo animal that somehow escaped its enclosure." "I suppose I am," Beatrice replied, looking back out at the crowded floor. "Though I'm not sure if I'm the predator or the prey in their eyes." Adrian shifted his weight. He had a slight limp, another well-known defect, a remnant of a hunting accident his father furiously tried to cover up. The king wanted a perfect heir. Adrian was anything but. "They think you're tragic," Adrian said, his slate eyes fixed on the crowd. "Which is worse than being a monster. If you're a monster, they fear you. If you're tragic, they pity you, and pity is just disguised contempt." Beatrice looked at him. Really looked at him. The royal portraits painted him as a brooding, flawless specimen of royalty. Up close, he just looked tired. There were dark circles beneath his eyes, and a tight tension in his jaw that spoke of a perpetual headache. "I don't feel tragic," Beatrice said quietly. The truth slipped out before she could build her walls. "I feel rested." Adrian turned his head, his gaze finally snapping to hers. For the first time all evening, the boredom vanished from his expression. A sharp, assessing intelligence flashed in his eyes. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't say, "I'm sorry for your circumstances." "Cedric Montgomery is a fool," Adrian stated, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "Not because he left you, but because he did it clumsily. He threw away a queen's piece on the board just to keep his pawns." "I wasn't a queen's piece," Beatrice corrected, tracing the rim of her glass. "I was a sack of gold used to settle a debt. He didn't want the gold, so he handed it back." "You underestimate yourself, Lady Beatrice." Adrian pushed off the pillar. He stepped closer, bringing with him the smell of sandalwood, rain, and sharp liquor. "I read the dissolution papers. My father's spies get their hands on everything. You didn't contest it. You didn't demand a larger settlement. You just walked away." "I was tired of the corset," she said dryly. Adrian's mouth twitched. A genuine, reluctant smile broke through his grim demeanor. It changed his entire face. "I find myself tired of corsets as well," he murmured. "Though the ones I wear are entirely metaphorical. The king is pressuring me to marry. He has paraded a dozen empty-headed duchesses in front of me, all of whom look at my hand and try not to gag." He held up his scarred wrist, the skin pulling tight over the bone. Beatrice didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She just looked at it, then back up to his eyes. "Does it hurt?" "Only when it rains," he replied, lowering his hand. The silence between them felt different now, less like a casual encounter and more like a locked room. "I need a wife, Beatrice, but I do not need a lover, nor a fragile flower who will weep when I forget our anniversary. I need an ally, someone who understands transactions, someone who cannot be blackmailed with scandal because she has already survived the worst of it." Beatrice's breath caught. The heat of the ballroom suddenly faded. She stared at the crown prince, seeing the cold, desperate calculation in his slate eyes. He wasn't asking for a dance. He was offering a kingdom. The music from the ballroom swelled, a frantic waltz that seemed to mock the stillness in the alcove. Beatrice stared at Adrian's scarred hand, then up at his exhausted, relentless eyes. She didn't gasp. She didn't politely pretend to misunderstand him. "An ally," she repeated. The words felt heavy on her tongue, tasting of copper and cheap wine. "You want to marry a woman who was publicly discarded 3 weeks ago to spite the king?" "Spite is a child's motivation," Adrian said. He turned his gaze toward the heavy glass doors leading to the terrace. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a thick, suffocating humidity. "I do it for leverage. My father wants me married to the Duke of Cornwall's daughter. The girl is barely 17, giggles when she is nervous, and reports every whisper back to her father, who in turn reports to the king. If I marry her, I am watched in my own bedroom. If I marry you, the king gets nothing. You have no powerful family backing you anymore. You are socially isolated. To the court, you are a pariah. To me, you are a vault." He pushed the heavy glass door open. The night air rolled in, smelling of wet soot, crushed pavement, and the distant briny scent of the Thames. "Walk with me." Beatrice hesitated, the plum silk of her dress clinging damply to her legs. She stepped out onto the wet stone. The terrace was empty. The chill immediately bit through her thin shawl, raising goosebumps along her arms, but she welcomed the sharp sting. It grounded her. "What makes you think I won't spy for the king?" she asked, leaning her hands against the cold, wet stone of the balustrade. The grit dug into her palms. Adrian stood beside her. He didn't offer his jacket. Beatrice appreciated that. She didn't want chivalry. She wanted the truth. "Because the king is the one who approved Cedric's petition for dissolution so quickly," Adrian replied flatly. "Your former husband required a royal seal to push the paperwork through without a public tribunal. The king granted it because Cedric's new intended, the inappropriate woman, is the king's own illegitimate niece. Your humiliation was state-sponsored, Lady Beatrice." The breath punched out of her lungs. The sheer, cold logistics of it settled into her bones. Cedric hadn't just abandoned her. The crown had facilitated it. Her father had lost half his remaining influence just trying to keep the Harrington name out of the mud, completely unaware that the mud had been slung from the throne itself. A sudden, vicious spike of anger flared in her chest, hot and bright. It felt entirely different from the hollow relief of her wedding night. It felt like survival. "If I agree to this," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "I am not moving into the palace to be your silent, suffering martyr. I will not sit in a parlor doing needlepoint while the court whispers about my ruined reputation. If I am to be a vault, I require the keys to the estate." Adrian turned his head. The dim light from the ballroom caught the sharp angle of his jaw. "Define your terms." "Financial independence," she stated, looking him dead in the eye. "My dowry is mine. It does not go into the royal treasury. I want my own staff, hired by me, reporting to me. And I want it in writing that if this arrangement becomes intolerable, I have the right to withdraw to the country estate without being accused of treason." She was pushing too hard. She knew it. You did not give ultimatums to the crown prince. But Beatrice was tired of being a piece on someone else's board. Adrian looked at her for a long, agonizing minute. The only sound was the drip of rainwater from the gutters and the distant clatter of carriage wheels on the cobblestones below. His slate eyes dropped to her mouth, then back up to her eyes. "Done," he said. He didn't smile. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small silver flask. He unscrewed the cap with his good hand, his scarred thumb pressing awkwardly against the metal, and took a long drink. He wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist and offered it to her. Beatrice looked at the flask. It wasn't a civilized toast. It was a blood oath in an alleyway. She took the cold metal, brought it to her lips, and drank. The whiskey burned like liquid fire down her throat, settling heavily in her stomach. She coughed, a harsh, ugly sound, and handed it back. "My solicitors will arrive at your father's townhouse at noon tomorrow," Adrian said, pocketing the flask. "Wear something dark. We are going to war, Beatrice, not a wedding." "I despise weddings anyway," she replied, her voice raspy from the liquor. Adrian gave a low, dry chuckle. It was a terrible sound, lacking any real joy, but it was the most honest thing she had heard all night. "Good. Go home, Lady Beatrice. Get some sleep. Tomorrow the wolves will realize they left meat on the bone." The royal study did not smell like a seat of power. It smelled like a sick room. 3 days after the terrace, Beatrice stood perfectly still on the center of a monstrously thick hunting rug. The air in the room was stifling, kept at a roasting temperature despite the July heat outside. Heavy, blood-red velvet curtains blocked the sunlight, leaving the massive chamber bathed in the sickly yellow glow of dozens of candelabras. Underneath the scent of burning beeswax and heavy frankincense was a sour, undeniable undertone of decaying flesh. King Henry's gout was legendary, but the reality of the man was far more pathetic and terrifying than the rumors. He sat slumped in a massive leather armchair, his swollen, bandaged leg propped up on a velvet stool. He was a mountain of a man, his face a landscape of burst capillaries and loose, graying skin. But his eyes, small, dark, and wet, were terrifyingly lucid. Adrian stood 2 feet to Beatrice's left. He had not looked at her since they entered. He wore his formal military uniform, the stiff collar pressing high against his jaw. He was a statue of dark wool and brass buttons. "You bring a soiled rag into my study and call it a flag of truce," the king wheezed, his voice like dry leaves crushing together. He didn't look at Adrian. He stared directly at Beatrice. It wasn't a gaze. It was a dissection. Beatrice dug her fingernails into the palms of her hands. The leather of her gloves stretched tight. She wore navy blue, severe, unadorned. She focused on the erratic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Tick, tick, tick. "I bring my future wife, Your Majesty," Adrian said. His voice was completely devoid of inflection. It was the tone of a man reporting grain yields. "The paperwork was filed this morning with the Archbishop. The banns will be read on Sunday." The king laughed. It was a wet, rattling sound that ended in a violent coughing fit. A nervous valet scrambled forward with a linen handkerchief, which the king snatched away, wiping his mouth furiously. "You think you are clever, boy," the king spat, throwing the stained cloth onto a silver tray. "You think taking Cedric Montgomery's leavings is a political masterstroke. It is a temper tantrum. I told you to marry the Cornwall girl." "The Cornwall girl is a child," Adrian countered, his posture rigid. "Lady Beatrice brings no political entanglements, no demanding father looking for a seat on the Privy Council, and she understands the heavy burden of public scrutiny." "She brings the stench of failure," the king roared, slamming a heavy ringed fist onto the armrest of his chair. The sudden violence made Beatrice flinch, her shoulders jerking upward. She hated herself for it instantly. The king noticed. A cruel yellow smile stretched across his face. "Look at her. She flinches like a beaten dog. You think this broken thing is fit to wear the crown of the consort? She couldn't even keep a minor lord in her bed for a single night." The humiliation was a physical wave of heat that washed over Beatrice's face and neck. It felt like the ballroom all over again, but concentrated, weaponized. She looked at the floor, staring at the woven threads of the rug. "Don't speak," she told herself. "Don't react. You're a vault." "Her previous marriage was dissolved before consummation," Adrian said. His voice dropped a fraction, the gravelly edge sharpening into a blade. "A dissolution, I might add, that Your Majesty stamped with remarkable speed. I wonder how the public would react if they knew the crown expedited a divorce simply to free a bed for your bastard niece." Silence crashed down on the room. It was absolute and suffocating. The valet in the corner stopped breathing. Beatrice's head snapped up. She looked at Adrian, but he was staring dead at his father, his ruined right hand resting casually on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. It was an explicit, undeniable threat. Adrian was threatening the king with public scandal. The king's face turned a dangerous mottled purple. The veins in his thick neck pulsed against his greasy collar. "You dare threaten me in my own sanctuary, you crippled whelp?" "I am securing my future, father," Adrian replied smoothly. "You want an heir. I want autonomy. Beatrice will give you the former, and her lack of alliances guarantees the latter. The Cornwall alliance is dead. You will sign the marriage decree, or I will hand the documents regarding Cedric Montgomery's sudden fortune to the opposition papers by midnight." It was extortion. Pure, unadulterated political blackmail. Beatrice realized, with a sudden chill that cut through the roasting heat of the room, that Adrian had not brought her here to defend her honor. He had brought her here as a prop, a visual aid for his checkmate. She felt a sharp, unexpected pang of disappointment in her chest. She had thought, for a brief moment on the terrace, that they were partners. But she was still just a piece on the board. The only difference was that Adrian was a far more ruthless player than Cedric ever could be. The king stared at his son, his breath whistling through his nose. He looked at Adrian's hand on the sword hilt, then slowly shifted his wet, dark eyes to Beatrice. The contempt in his gaze had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating hatred. "You are playing a dangerous game, little bird," the king whispered, his voice echoing in the stifling room. "You think you have found a protector, but my son does not build shields. He builds weapons, and when a weapon breaks, he throws it away." The king reached for a heavy gold pen resting on the table beside him. He dragged the marriage decree forward and signed his name with vicious, tearing strokes. He shoved the parchment off the table. It fluttered to the floor, landing near Beatrice's feet. "Get out of my sight," the king wheezed, closing his eyes. "Both of you." Adrian didn't wait. He turned on his heel, his limp slightly more pronounced, and walked toward the heavy oak doors. Beatrice looked down at the parchment. The royal seal glared up at her, red as fresh blood. She stooped down, her corset digging into her bruised ribs, picked up the paper, and followed the prince into the dark, echoing halls of the palace. The scent of rotting flesh clung to her clothes long after they had left. The royal chapel of St. Jude was not grand. Tucked away in the damp northern corner of the palace grounds, it was a narrow, windowless stone corridor that smelled of mildew, cold earth, and the archbishop's stale, garlic-laced breath. It was a Tuesday morning, 7 o'clock. The rain had returned, a relentless gray drizzle that soaked through the stained glass and cast the altar in a bruised violet light. There were no flowers. There was no choir. The only attendees were two palace guards flanking the heavy oak doors, their breathing a rhythmic metallic rasp behind their visors. Beatrice wore a walking dress of dark charcoal wool. It was practical, severe, and completely devoid of lace. Her previous wedding had been a suffocating spectacle of satin and pearls. This felt like a business transaction in an alleyway. She preferred this. Adrian stood beside her. He looked terrible. The bruised shadows under his slate eyes were darker, his jaw tight with a tension that radiated from him in sharp, aggressive waves. He smelled of rain, wet leather, and black coffee. He hadn't bothered with a formal uniform, wearing a dark riding coat that was damp at the shoulders. "The rings," the archbishop mumbled, his arthritic fingers fumbling with a small velvet cushion. He looked terrified, eager to finish the treasonous ceremony before the king changed his mind and ordered them all to the tower. Adrian didn't wait for the priest to offer the cushion. He snatched the smaller ring, a thick, heavy band of unadorned white gold, and turned to Beatrice. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He took her left hand. His grip was entirely functional. As he slid the ring onto her finger, Beatrice felt the rough, warped texture of his burn scars graze her knuckles. The skin was unnaturally smooth in some places, thickly ridged in others. The ring was cold. It slipped past her knuckle and settled heavy at the base of her finger. It felt less like a promise and more like a shackle. "Yours," Adrian said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Beatrice picked up the larger band. She took his right hand. The king's physicians had wanted to amputate it after the fire, but Adrian had fought them off with a pistol in his left hand. The scars snaked up past his wrist, disappearing into the dark wool of his sleeve. She didn't hesitate. She didn't handle him like he was fragile. She gripped his warped fingers firmly and shoved the ring into place. "I pronounce you," the archbishop squeaked, his eyes darting to the door, "husband and wife. May God have mercy on your union." There was no kiss. Adrian dropped her hand immediately, turned, and walked down the short aisle. Beatrice followed, the heavy wool of her skirt brushing against the damp stone floor. 2 hours later, she was standing in the center of the East Wing apartments, her new domain. It was a cavernous suite of rooms that had belonged to the previous queen, empty for a decade. It smelled of camphor, dead spiders, and heavy, suffocating dust. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, sealing the stale air inside. "It's a tomb, Your Highness," Edith said. The gruff, broad-shouldered maid Beatrice had brought from her father's townhouse stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. Edith smelled reassuringly of lye soap and starch. "Then we will resurrect it," Beatrice said. She walked to the nearest window, unlatched the heavy brass lock, and shoved the heavy pane open. The damp, cold London air rushed in, sweeping away the scent of camphor. "Tear down the curtains, Edith. All of them. Burn them if you have to. And send word to the royal steward. I want the rugs replaced. I will not live in a museum of dead women." "Yes, ma'am," Edith grunted, already rolling up her sleeves. Beatrice spent the rest of the day organizing. She didn't stop to eat. She didn't sit down. If she stopped, the sheer, crushing reality of what she had done would catch up to her. She was the crown princess. She was tethered to a man who viewed her as a political shield, living in a palace ruled by a king who openly despised her. At midnight, the heavy oak door of her sitting room clicked open. Beatrice was sitting at the mahogany desk, going over the household ledgers the steward had reluctantly handed over. She looked up. Adrian stood in the doorway. He had finally changed out of his damp riding clothes, wearing a loose linen shirt and dark trousers. He held a thick, leather-bound folder in his good hand. He looked around the room. The curtains were gone. The fire was roaring, driving back the damp. "You work quickly." "I don't like dust," Beatrice replied, setting her pen down. The gold ring clinked heavily against the wood. "What is that?" He walked forward and dropped the folder onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. "The guest list and seating chart for tomorrow evening's banquet. The king is hosting a dinner to officially welcome his new niece into the royal fold." Beatrice stared at the leather cover. Her stomach gave a sharp, painful lurch. The tea she had consumed hours ago turned sour in her throat. "Cedric." "Lord and Lady Montgomery, yes," Adrian said, pulling a chair out and sitting across from her. He leaned back, the firelight catching the sharp, cruel angle of his cheekbones. "My father intends to parade them." He placed them at the high table, 3 seats down from us. Beatrice opened the folder. The names were written in sharp, precise calligraphy. Lord Cedric Montgomery, Lady Genevieve Montgomery. The ink felt like an insult. She had known she would have to face him eventually. But tomorrow, before she even had time to figure out the labyrinth of the court? "You look pale," Adrian observed. His tone wasn't sympathetic, it was analytical. "I am fine," Beatrice snapped, closing the folder abruptly. "I just didn't expect the king to be so overtly vulgar. My father is a butcher who wears a crown," Adrian said flatly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk, his slate eyes locked onto hers, pinning her in place. "They're going to look at you, Beatrice. They're going to wait for your hands to shake. They are going to wait for you to look away when Cedric speaks. Genevieve will wear diamonds, and Cedric will act as if he is the victor." "And what will you do?" she asked, her voice tight. "I will eat my roasted pheasant," Adrian replied. "Because I already won. You are the crown princess. He is a minor lord playing at importance. Tomorrow night, you do not look at them with anger, Beatrice. You look at them with absolute unyielding boredom. You're a vault. Prove it." He stood up, leaving the folder on her desk. He didn't say goodnight. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Beatrice alone with the crackling fire and the heavy, sickening dread settling in her bones. The diadem weighed exactly 2 pounds and 4 ounces. Beatrice knew this because Edith had weighed it on the kitchen scales before ruthlessly pinning it into Beatrice's hair. It was a brutal piece of ancient silver, encrusted with sapphires that looked like frozen bruises. The silver pin scraped against her scalp, sending a low, throbbing ache down the back of her neck. "It's crooked," Beatrice muttered, staring at the stranger in the vanity mirror. "It's not the crown, Your Highness. It's your neck. You're entirely too stiff," Edith replied, yanking fiercely on the laces of Beatrice's corset. This corset wasn't made of whalebone. It was reinforced with steel. It didn't pinch. It felt like armor. She wore midnight blue velvet. No lace, no ruffles, no seed pearls. The fabric swallowed the light, making her look like a shadow cast against the opulent gilded walls of her chamber. There was a sharp knock at the door. Adrian entered without waiting for a response. He wore the formal military dress of the crown prince, black wool, heavy gold epaulets, and a chest full of medals that clinked softly as he walked. He stopped in the center of the room, his eyes sweeping over her. "Adequate," he said. It was the highest praise she had heard him give anyone. He offered his left arm. Beatrice rested her hand on the stiff wool of his sleeve. Through her silk gloves, she could feel the hard, coiled tension in his muscles. As they walked down the grand corridor toward the banquet hall, she matched his uneven pace. Step, drag. Step, drag. The limp wasn't a weakness tonight. It was a metronome counting down to a battle. The great hall was a sensory assault. The heat was immense, generated by 3 massive hearths and thousands of beeswax candles dripping from the iron chandeliers. The air was thick with the smell of roasted pork, heavy garlic, spilled wine, and the underlying metallic tang of 400 nobles sweating through their silks. As the herald banged his staff on the stone floor, the deafening roar of conversation abruptly died, presenting His Royal Highness, Prince Adrian, and Her Royal Highness, Princess Beatrice. They walked in. The silence was absolute, save for the rustle of Beatrice's velvet skirts and the sharp click of Adrian's boot heels. Beatrice kept her chin level. The sapphire diadem dug viciously into her scalp. She felt 100 pairs of eyes stripping her bare, dissecting the scandal, looking for the discarded bride under the velvet. She forced her breathing to slow. Smell the pork. Feel the steel corset. Be the vault. They reached the dais. King Henry was already seated, a mountain of velvet and malice, chewing on a piece of gristle. He didn't look up as they took their seats to his right. 10 minutes later, the herald's voice rang out again. Presenting Lord Cedric Montgomery and Lady Genevieve Montgomery. Beatrice's chest tightened so violently her ribs ached. She picked up her silver goblet, the cold metal biting into her palm. She took a sip of water. It tasted like salt. Cedric walked in. He looked exactly as he had on their wedding night, immaculate, arrogant, his dark hair perfectly styled. But beside him walked Genevieve. She was petite, with a mass of golden curls and a dress of spun sugar pink that cost more than Beatrice's entire former dowry. Around her neck sat a massive, vulgar diamond pendant, the king's gift. They approached the dais to bow to the king. Genevieve offered a deep theatrical curtsy, her pink skirts pooling around her. Cedric bowed smoothly. "Rise, my dear," the king wheezed, finally smiling. It was a terrible, wet expression. "You look radiant." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Genevieve said. Her voice was high, breathy, and intentionally loud. She turned her head, her gaze sweeping past Adrian and locking directly onto Beatrice. A sharp, triumphant smirk played on her glossy lips. She had won the man. She had the diamonds. Cedric looked at Beatrice then. For a fraction of a second, his arrogant facade slipped. His pale blue eyes widened slightly, taking in the heavy silver diadem, the midnight velvet, the sheer, untouchable authority she suddenly radiated. He looked down at his own lapels, suddenly appearing very small. Beatrice felt a rush of adrenaline, sharp and clear. Adrian was right. Cedric was nothing. Genevieve, however, was not finished. As they moved to take their seats down the table, Genevieve paused directly behind Beatrice's chair. "Princess Beatrice," Genevieve said loudly, ensuring the nobles at the surrounding tables could hear. "What a surprising elevation for you. I was told you had retired to the country. It must be terribly exhausting having to attend these functions after such a strenuous month." The silence around the high table thickened. The king paused his chewing, watching with gleaming, expectant eyes. Cedric stood rigidly beside his new wife, suddenly looking violently uncomfortable. Beatrice slowly set her silver goblet down. She turned her head, looking up at Genevieve. She didn't glare. She didn't flush. She let her face go completely, terrifyingly blank. "Lady Genevieve," Beatrice said, her voice carrying clearly over the crackle of the hearths. "I find the country too quiet, though I see you have brought enough noise to compensate for us all." A few nobles at the lower tables inhaled sharply. Genevieve's smirk faltered, her cheeks flushing a patchy, ugly red. I only meant... Before she could finish, a warm, rough weight settled over Beatrice's left hand, which rested on the table. It was Adrian. He didn't look at Genevieve. He didn't even look at Cedric. He picked up his carving knife with his left hand, his scarred right hand covering Beatrice's completely. The heat of his palm was shocking, burning through her thin silk glove. "Move along, Montgomery," Adrian said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The gravelly baritone cut through the air like a butcher's blade. "You are blocking the servants from bringing the sauce, and your wife's perfume is ruining my appetite." Cedric flinched as if he had been struck. He grabbed Genevieve by the elbow, his fingers digging into her pink silk, and practically dragged her to their seats. Beatrice sat frozen. The interaction had lasted less than a minute, but she felt entirely drained. She looked down at the table. Adrian hadn't moved his hand. His warped, scarred fingers remained draped heavily over hers. It was a public branding, a message to the entire court. "She is mine, and you do not touch her." "Breathe," Adrian murmured, so low only she could hear. Beatrice inhaled sharply, the scent of the roasted pork and the heavy beeswax filling her lungs. She turned her hand slightly, just enough so her fingers curled against the rough, ruined skin of his palm. She didn't pull away. For the first time since the night Cedric handed her the divorce papers, Beatrice didn't feel alone in the room. November brought a bitter, biting cold that seeped through the thick stone walls of the east wing. It had been 4 months since the banquet, 4 months of tight corsets, cold smiles, and a relentless, exhausting war of attrition waged entirely in whispers. Beatrice spent most of her days in the private study, buried beneath mountains of parchment, wax seals, and leather-bound ledgers. The room smelled of dry paper, ink, and the sharp tang of the lemon oil Edith used on the woodwork. Beatrice sat at the desk, her fingers stained black from a leaky quill. Her eyes burned. She rubbed the bridge of her nose, pushing aside a heavy stack of shipping manifests. When Adrian had promised her financial independence, he had handed over the keys to the Queen's private estate, a massive, sprawling web of tenant farms, textile mills, and overseas investments that had been neglected for a decade. Beatrice hadn't just organized it, she had weaponized it. She pulled the master ledger toward her. The spine cracked loudly in the quiet room. She traced her finger down the column of numbers, the rough parchment catching on her dry skin. Cedric Montgomery's new, inflated wealth was an illusion. Beatrice had spent weeks tracking the sudden influx of capital that had allowed Cedric to buy his grand new estate in Mayfair and drape Genevieve in diamonds. It hadn't come from his father. It had come from a royal charter, a lucrative trade monopoly on imported silks granted to Cedric by King Henry as a wedding gift. But the charter required capital to operate. Cedric had borrowed heavily from the Royal Bank to fund his first 3 shipping expeditions. Beatrice smiled. It wasn't a happy expression. It was a baring of teeth in an empty room. The Royal Bank didn't technically belong to the king. Due to an archaic 300-year-old law, the primary shareholder of the Royal Bank's colonial division was the Queen's estate, which meant, effectively, Beatrice owned Cedric's debt. The heavy oak door creaked open. The draft instantly snuffed out 2 of the candles on her desk. Adrian walked in. The drop in temperature over the past week had been brutal on him. His limp was pronounced, a heavy, dragging step that he usually managed to mask in public. He looked gray. He was sweating despite the chill, his dark hair clinging damply to his forehead. He wore a loose wool sweater instead of his usual stiff coats, his scarred right hand tucked protectively against his chest. He didn't speak. He walked straight to the heavy leather armchair by the fire and collapsed into it. He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow and rapid. Beatrice didn't ask if he was all right. It was a stupid question. She stood up, her joints popping from hours of sitting, and walked over to the mahogany side table. She picked up a heavy crystal decanter, the glass cold against her palm, and poured 2 fingers of amber brandy into a tumbler. She walked over to the fire and held the glass out. Adrian opened one slate-gray eye. He looked at the glass, then at her. He reached out with his left hand, his fingers brushing hers. His skin was freezing. He downed the brandy in a single harsh swallow and rested the glass on his knee. "The king's physicians were just in my quarters," Adrian rasped. His voice sounded like cracked stone. "They wanted to bleed me to balance the humors in my leg. I threw a brass candlestick at the head surgeon." "Did you hit him?" Beatrice asked, moving to stand by the mantelpiece. The heat of the fire roasted the back of her wool skirt. "Missed by an inch," Adrian muttered, rubbing his temple. "Next time, I'll use my left hand." The silence settled between them, comfortable and heavy. They didn't share a bed. They didn't share declarations of affection, but they shared a foxhole. They spent their evenings in this study, dismantling the king's allies piece by piece, an unspoken synchronicity guiding their hands. "I found it," Beatrice said quietly. Adrian stopped rubbing his temple. He opened both eyes, the exhaustion instantly eclipsed by a sharp, predatory focus. "The debt? All of it," Beatrice confirmed, walking back to her desk and picking up the master ledger. She brought it over and dropped it into his lap. He grunted slightly at the weight. Cedric took out a secondary mortgage on the Mayfair property to cover the delays in his shipping line. The winter storms in the Atlantic have kept his fleet docked in the West Indies. He has missed 2 consecutive payments to the Colonial Division. Under the terms of the charter, the bank has the right to call in the entirety of the loan. Adrian stared at the numbers. He ran his warped, scarred thumb over Beatrice's neat black handwriting. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows across his face. "If we call in the loan," Adrian said, his voice dropping to a low murmur, "he won't be able to pay. The bank will seize the Mayfair estate. The king cannot bail him out without publicly admitting he is funneling crown funds to his illegitimate niece's husband. It would cause a revolt in the House of Lords." "He will be bankrupt," Beatrice said flatly. "Worse than bankrupt. He will be a public failure, the very thing he married Genevieve to avoid." Adrian looked up from the ledger. His eyes locked onto hers. There was no triumph in his expression, only a grim, mirroring acknowledgement of the violence they were about to commit with ink and paper. "You are sure about this, Beatrice?" he asked. The use of her given name, stripped of titles, felt heavy. "Once I sign the order, it goes to the magistrates. There is no reversing it. He will be ruined." Beatrice thought of the wedding night, the smell of damp wool, the sound of Cedric tapping his signet ring against the desk, entirely bored as he discarded her. She didn't feel a rush of righteous vengeance. She just felt a cold, deep finality. "I have the drafting order already written," Beatrice said, turning back to the desk. She picked up the parchment and a freshly dipped quill. "I just need your signature." She handed him the quill. Adrian took it in his left hand. He didn't hesitate. He scrawled his name at the bottom of the page, the ink slashing aggressively across the parchment. He handed it back. "Done," Adrian said. He leaned his head back against the leather chair and closed his eyes again. Let him drown. The royal glass house was a suffocating monument to the king's vanity. Located at the southern edge of the palace gardens, it was an enormous structure of iron and glass, artificially heated by underground steam pipes to mimic the jungles of the colonies. It smelled of wet loam, overripe citrus, and the sickly, rotting sweetness of blooming orchids. It was late December. The palace was hosting the annual winter solstice reception. The main hall was packed with sweating aristocrats, fake cheer, and the endless grating sound of string quartets. Beatrice had slipped away. The heat of the ballroom had made her dizzy, the steel of her corset pressing a dull ache into her ribs. She walked slowly down the central aisle of the glass house, the humid air clinging to her face and dampening the high collar of her emerald green gown. The silence here was thick, broken only by the steady, rhythmic drip of condensation falling from the glass ceiling onto the broad, waxy leaves of the ferns. Drip, slap, drip, slap. I thought I might find you hiding. The voice made the hairs on the back of Beatrice's neck stand up. She stopped, her velvet slippers sinking slightly into the damp gravel of the path. She turned slowly. Cedric stood 10 feet away, stepping out from behind a massive cluster of banana trees. He looked catastrophic. The immaculate, arrogant lord from the wedding night was gone. His dark hair was unkempt, curling wildly in the humidity. His cravat was loose, and there were dark, bruised bags under his pale blue eyes. He smelled heavily of gin and stale sweat. Beatrice didn't flinch. She just stared at him, noting the tremor in his hands. "I am not hiding, Lord Montgomery," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into the flat, deadened tone she used for strangers. "I am taking the air, though it seems the air here has been thoroughly spoiled." Cedric's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. "Drop the act, Beatrice. We both know what you've done." "I have done many things today," she replied, keeping her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "You will have to be specific." "The bank!" Cedric shouted, the sound violently loud in the quiet humidity. He took another step, closing the distance between them. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "The magistrates arrived at my estate this morning. During breakfast, they brought an eviction notice. They are freezing my accounts, seizing the ships." "Ah," Beatrice said smoothly. It is a matter of basic accounting, Cedric. You borrowed money you did not have to fund an enterprise you did not understand. The bank merely collected its due." "The bank didn't collect anything," Cedric hissed, his face flushing a dark, mottled red. "The Crown Prince collected it, and we both know why. You whispered in his ear. You used your crippled husband to exact a petty, hysterical revenge. The insult to Adrian sparked a hot, sudden flare of anger in her chest, but she smothered it instantly. She would not give Cedric the satisfaction of a reaction. "If I wanted revenge," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the humid air like a razor, "I would have ruined you the day I arrived at court. I didn't ruin you, Cedric. You ruined yourself. You mortgaged your future to impress a king who views you as a convenient joke. You are a bad investment. I simply foreclosed on it." Cedric stared at her. His chest heaved. He looked wildly around the empty glass house, as if expecting someone to jump out and tell him it was a prank. He looked back at her, his pale eyes wide and desperate. "Genevieve is pregnant," he blurted out. His voice cracked. The arrogance shattered entirely, leaving behind a pathetic, terrified boy. "If we lose the Mayfair house, if the ships are seized, the scandal will kill her. Her father will cut us off. The king will turn his back on us. Please, Beatrice." He reached out and grabbed her arm. His fingers dug painfully into the velvet sleeve of her dress. His grip was slick with sweat. Beatrice looked down at his hand. The disgust rose in her throat, thick and acrid. "Take your hand off me," she said. The command wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute freezing authority of the crown. Cedric didn't let go. He pulled her slightly closer, his breath hot and reeking of gin against her face. "You used to be kind. You used to be quiet and kind. Please, just tell the bank to grant me a 6-month extension. That's all I need." "You're confusing kindness with subservience," Beatrice said, staring dead into his bloodshot eyes. "I granted you a divorce because you were a coward who couldn't stomach his own choices. I'm granting you bankruptcy for the exact same reason." With a sudden, violent jerk, Beatrice ripped her arm out of his grasp. Cedric stumbled forward, thrown off balance. His hip collided hard with a wrought iron pedestal holding a massive terracotta pot of orchids. The pedestal wobbled. Cedric scrambled to catch it, but his gin-soaked reflexes were too slow. The heavy pot crashed to the gravel path. The sound of shattering terracotta was deafening. Wet black earth and crushed white petals exploded across the stones, spattering the hem of Beatrice's dress and Cedric's polished boots. Cedric fell to his knees in the dirt. He stared at the ruined orchids, his hands hovering uselessly over the mess. He looked utterly broken. Beatrice looked down at him. She felt no pity. She felt no triumphant joy. She just felt tired. "Do not approach me again, Lord Montgomery," she said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. "If you do, I will not use the bank. I will use the palace guard." She turned and walked away, her skirts dragging through the damp earth and shattered clay. She pushed open the heavy iron doors of the glass house and stepped out into the freezing December night. The shock of the cold air hit her face, crisp and clean, washing away the stench of gin and rotting flowers. A shadow detached itself from the stone wall of the courtyard. Adrian stepped into the moonlight. He was leaning heavily on his silver-tipped cane, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He had been waiting. He looked at Beatrice, his slate eyes dropping to the wet dirt staining the hem of her emerald gown. He looked back up to her face. "Is it done?" he asked. Beatrice let out a long, shaky breath, her breath pluming white in the freezing air. The tension drained out of her, leaving her hollow but terrifyingly light. "It's done," she said. She walked over to him, her shivering hands finding the rough, warm wool of his coat sleeve. "Take me inside. I'm freezing." The death bell of St. Jude tolled at exactly 4:15. It was a brutal, resonant sound vibrating through the palace's heavy stone foundation, rattling the loose glass in the east wing. Bong, bong, bong. It didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like an eviction. King Henry didn't die a heroic death. There was no profound speech, no passing of the torch. He choked on phlegm and sour wine in his sleep, his heart finally giving out under his own immense, gluttonous weight. Beatrice stood by her bedchamber window, her heavy wool shawl pulled tight against the draft, watching the courtyard fill with scrambling servants. Rain fell in sheets, turning the cobblestones black. The palace smelled different today. The underlying stench of rotting lilies and stale sweat that had permeated the corridors for years was suddenly violently washed away by the metallic tang of cold morning air and sharp panic. Edith entered, carrying a steaming wash basin and a black mourning dress draped over her thick forearm. "The Archbishop just left the royal apartments," Edith grunted, setting the basin down with a heavy thud. "It's official, Your Highness. The king is gone." "Are the courtiers awake?" Beatrice asked, not turning from the glass. "Swarming like rats in a flooded cellar," Edith replied, laying the black wool out. "I saw Cornwall weeping in the corridor, a remarkable performance considering he secretly funded the opposition all winter." Beatrice turned to look at the dress. It was devoid of jewels or lace. It was practical. It was armor. "Where is he?" "In the king's study. He threw the physicians out half an hour ago and locked the doors." Beatrice dressed quickly. The steel corset felt tighter today, a reassuring, grounding pressure against her ribs. She tied her hair back with a simple black ribbon. Stepping into the grand corridor, the shift in power was physical. Courtiers who had spent the last 8 months whispering behind lace fans, waiting for her to stumble, now pressed their backs against the tapestries to make way. They bowed, deep, desperate bows, their powdered wigs brushing the damp floors. They didn't meet her eyes. They looked at her like she was a loaded pistol. At the king's study, the 2 guards straightened instantly. "The prince gave orders not to be disturbed, Your Royal Highness." The young guard wavered, terrified of making the wrong choice on the day the world turned upside down. "I am not a disturbance," Beatrice said flatly. "Open the door." The guards exchanged a frantic glance before the older one turned the heavy iron handle. The study was freezing. King Henry's roasting heat was gone. The hearths held only smoking gray ash. The velvet curtains were torn back, windows thrown wide to the driving rain. Adrian stood by the open window in shirt sleeves and dark trousers, his back completely rigid. Wind whipped his dark hair, and his soaked linen clung to the heavy, scarred muscles of his shoulders. He didn't turn as the door clicked shut, Beatrice walked slowly across the thick hunting rug. The smell of decaying flesh still lingered faintly in the upholstery, but the freezing wind was steadily ripping it away. She stopped behind him. "They are waiting for you in the throne room," she said quietly. Adrian looked down. In his left palm rested the king's signet ring, the same vulgar chunk of ruby that had sealed Cedric's divorce papers. He looked so small. Adrian rasped over the lashing rain. They covered him with a sheet, and the mountain became a molehill. 40 years of tyranny ends with a wet cough. "That is the nature of tyrants," Beatrice replied. "They die like the rest of us. They just leave a larger mess behind." Adrian let out a short, harsh breath. He finally turned. His face was gray, exhaustion carving 10 years into his skin. He held up his scarred right hand, the shiny pink skin stretching tight as he slightly curled his fingers. "They'll expect me to put this on, to sit in that chair. Half of them will be waiting for me to fail because I'm broken." "You are not broken," Beatrice said. She didn't soften her voice. She stepped forward, closing the distance. "You are scarred. A broken sword shatters in battle. A scarred sword has simply survived the fire." His slate-gray eyes locked onto hers. The defensive walls he kept erected so perfectly slipped, revealing the terrifying vulnerability beneath. Beatrice reached out, taking the heavy, cold ring from his left hand. She didn't ask permission. She took his right hand, the ruined, twisted hand the court couldn't bear to look at. She felt the uneven ridges of his skin, the rough texture of a man who refused to be amputated from his own life. She slid the ring onto his index finger. It fit perfectly. Slowly, Adrian intertwined his warped fingers with hers. His grip was strong and warm. He raised his left hand, his thumb brushing roughly, clumsily against her jawline, sending a sharp, electric jolt through her chest. "You aren't going to run, are you?" he murmured. "I signed the marriage register, Adrian," Beatrice said with a rare, cynical smile. "I don't do things twice. Besides, someone has to audit the treasury. The king left it in ruins." Adrian let out a low, genuine laugh, rough and wonderful in the cold room. He leaned down and pressed his mouth to hers. It wasn't tentative. It tasted of whiskey, rain, and absolute certainty. It was the kiss of a man who had finally found the one person who wouldn't flinch. Beatrice kissed him back, anchoring him by his damp collar. When they broke apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "Are you ready, Queen Beatrice?" Beatrice looked out the window at the sprawling city waking to a new era. She thought of Cedric broken in the dirt. She thought of the seed pearls left on the floor. "Let them come," she said. And that is how the discarded bride traded a ruined wedding dress for a crown of iron. Beatrice didn't win by being sweet, forgiving, or passively waiting for karma. She won by becoming the smartest, most ruthless player on the board, standing shoulder to shoulder with a prince who matched her fire. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into historical revenge and power. If you enjoyed Beatrice and Adrian's gritty rise to the throne, please smash that like button. Share this video with your fellow drama lovers and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below. Would you have crushed Cedric's empire or let him be? See you in the next story.